So good morning. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy day, and we'll try to keep this under the hour depending on the level of discussion. This is not a public hearing. This is a work session to go over the technicalities of proposed Bill 155-34, which basically addresses drones. But before I do that, I'd like to extend the opportunity. First, I'd like to thank my colleague, Senator Estevez here, who had a major part in fashioning the draft legislation, and of course Kate Baltazar to my right, who was the lead technical advisor on the bill. We have different representatives from both the local and federal government, so if we could just take the opportunity to introduce ourselves, starting with yourself, Senator. I'm sorry I missed. We have the representative of Senator Telena Nelson, so the chief is here. Pete, you can introduce yourself when we get to you. I just want to thank you for coming on behalf of your senator.
Test. Andrew Languero, Senior Advisor, Senator Will Castro's office.
Alfred Duenas, Deputy General Manager, Finance, Port Authority of Guam.
Doris Aguero, Port Police Chief, Port Authority of Guam.
AJ Balahaja, Guam Police Department, PIO.
Captain Stephen Lasho on behalf of the Guam Police Department.
Hafide Adonis Mendiola, Director, Department of Youth Affairs.
David Esmana, Port Police Supervisor.
Lieutenant Gene Camacho with the Port Authority Police.
Sergeant Sonde Yatar with the Marshals from the Judiciary of Guam.
Greg Jacobs, Region Program Director for Force Protection, Joint Region Marianas.
Hafide M. Harold Cruz, Chief of Staff for Senator Will Castro.
Pete Mesa, Chief of Staff for Senator Telena Nelson.
And we also have members of the media here, KOM in particular. Let me just, open with a quick 30-second overview. First of all, again, if I didn't invite you initially, there's some refreshments provided by members of our staff, some soup and some other light refreshments. In a nutshell, the drone legislation, the impetus, is basically to I caught this one story in a national spread about the potential use of unmanned aerial aircraft or vehicles, UAVs, depending on what you want to call them. They have different acronyms, drones for short, for the delivery of contraband in certain, restricted areas. And once we saw that, I brought it to the attention of Director Kate from the Department of Corrections, and began the first draft in June. I think it was the 26th of June that I distributed it via email. And thanks to Senator Estevez and his staff, they were able to provide some additional technical guidance. So the reason for this work session is because this bill is not all inclusive. It didn't take all things into consideration. And like most bills, admittedly for myself, we tend to miss a lot of the important technical pieces. And that's why we have these technical meetings 2, 3, 4, 5 times before we actually act on something substantive. There are some major concerns about the bill that were raised this morning, and I think it's going to make for an excellent discussion that goes beyond the jurisdiction of the territory. But before we even get there, before we put that obstacle in front of us as to whether or not Guam can do what it wants to do with its own airspace, I think we should have a healthy discussion about some of the things that we may want to consider anyway. I think if there's going to be an obstacle to maturing our laws, or at least our policies within your respective agencies and instrumentalities of the government, let us be the architects of those policies until such time we're ordered to do otherwise. And so with that said, it's free game here. We just want to extend common courtesy to anyone who's speaking, give them the opportunity to comment briefly. And I don't think any idea is a bad idea. I encourage you to ask hard questions. That's the only way I'll be able to defend the bill on the floor, or Senator Estevez or any of the other co-sponsors, Senator San Agustin, Senator Rodriguez, Senator Morrison, and Senator Muña. And if Senator Nelson, upon her return, I know she's the oversight chair for Homeland Security and law enforcement, and so she's going to be given the privilege to add her name as a co-sponsor to the bill if she finds suit. So, anybody else want to jump in and just comment off of that?
Senator, if you don't mind, Director Adonis Mendiola, Department of Youth Affairs. Other than the issue of promoting contraband that any would-be drone user would utilize the equipment to facilitate, one of the principal arguments we'd like to make as far as minors in our custody is obviously the confidentiality of those minors and anyone else that has any business knowing the minors' presence there. Of course, notwithstanding the fact that our facilities are so close to residential areas, in fact, it's quite difficult to prevent the identity of some of these minors. The fact is that if anybody has any business knowing anything like that, it's only those within the confines, and notwithstanding again the residents who might live nearby. So in that effort, I'd like to support it for those reasons, and thank you all for at least pushing the bill to the floor and allowing for us to give our input.
Okay, so that's Adonis with DYA, and if I could direct you to page 4, line 17. He's basically supporting the inclusion of DYA in the draft legislation. Any other comments on the bill? Even if you have strong reservations about the bill one way or the other, this is probably one of the best places to bring it up because, you know, we're very open to constructive criticism, and I actually welcome it. Director.
Venues or whatever is pretty good. The two components that are missing here are your ports, your international airport and the Port Authority of Guam. Any action on either of the ports would be catastrophic to the island.
I think that's a legitimate point, Director. I did get an email, a direct text from the general manager of the International Airport, Chuck Adams. Of the shipping facility. Did you have a comment?
Actually, we knew that the ports weren't included because we, under the assumption, we try not to go in any assumptions, that they were probably covered under FAA, and that's why we invited the airport, and you guys to come to this meeting.
But this being a local legislation,
Right.
people reading it and everything else would say, hey, we can operate because it's not here.
And you know,
that's not too many people would go to the federal, the Code of Federal Regulations to see whether the ports are covered. We know we're covered, and we got direct communications with the Coast Guard. But I'm talking about the local people. When this is passed and published, they look at it and say, hey, we can go down to this side of Port Authority and play with our drones because they're not covered in the legislation.
and
That's the only point of.
it's a legitimate point, and I've never really seen a conflict where local legislation that reinforces federal statute ever really comes into conflict. It's when you dilute federal statute that we start to have a problem. And so most states, especially in the grants world that are not related to law enforcement, I'm not so familiar with, FCC, FAA regulations, but in the regular grants world where monies come through to other agencies like the Department of Education, as long as you don't dilute, the state has that privilege to add additional criteria to regulate the utilization of monies or assets, but you cannot detract or take away from whatever it is the federal government's asking. So to your point, Mr. Duane, I think that's a good point. I think we can add it, and then we can have that discussion with the co-sponsors or other senators on the floor one way or the other.
It's just when the general public looks at it, and as drone becomes more popular as a family recreational activity, they would look at this bill and say, where are the restricted areas? And if it's not listed here, then it's okay to go out there.
Yeah, I just want to add also, yes, and so you brought up a key phrase, become more popular and in recreational areas. And so there's something, the recreational utilization of drones for purposes other than contraband or weaponizing it to hunt or to be voyeurs and take pictures of you in your 30-piece suit on the beach, for example. AJ, I'm referring to you, my friend. So we're good with jokes. So the enthusiasts were invited to come, and I just want to make it very clear for you drone users on a hobby level that this is not designed to be overly regulatory, to require 15 steps before you can even use a drone, let's say on a beach as an example. I mean, there's some basic requirements, but we want to make sure that everyone understands, at least from my perspective, I don't speak for the co-sponsors, but from my perspective, this is really about sensitive areas and about areas where issues of privacy and safety are of the utmost public concern. And I think as we start to see cases where people abuse that privilege of fewer regulations outside of that space, then we can legislate. But as far as I'm concerned, this bill as it stands is really meant to protect the law enforcement community. And frankly, thanks to the foresight of the Chief of Staff here, he was able to invite Joint Region Marianas because, as we're led to believe, even the United States Department of Defense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't have existing policy on drone use behind the fence, which blows my mind. It only reinforces the fact that this is new technology that the United States Congress and the administration, I would assume itself, is just coming to grasp with. And I think we all remember that incident when the drone flew in past the White House fence and all hell broke loose. Not just the drone, but that one-man aircraft that came and crashed into the front lawn or something. And so it's at the front of national policy discussion and debate. Anybody else want to jump in? Thank you. I think I have no reservations unless Senator Estevez, the chief co-sponsor here, has an exception to the recommendation.
No, I think it's good. I mean, that'd be a surprise. I think most residents don't even know, who live within 5 miles of the airport, that they don't control their own airspace. It actually brings up a whole other slew of issues in terms of property owner rights and the right to know. So I do support that. It should be in the statute so that they don't confuse the two. And then furthermore, I think it would be my recommendation that if this is looking to be more comprehensive, that the government, maybe in coordination with BSBP, really looks at, okay, what is that area delineation? Where are we talking about? Which is in that no-fly zone of the airport for the drones, especially for the hobbyists. Again, I'm still of the standpoint, I know we had discussed this, I think there still needs to be a registration aspect because you can't have enforcement without tracking. Am I correct on that? I believe, and you fly drones, right, that all drones should have a serial number associated with it?
Yeah, please, thank you.
The U.S. Court of Appeals decided May 19th of 2017 that you are no longer required to register your drone. I think that Congress will look at that and see about making it to where the court will be satisfied. So I think it might be an issue as far as locally trying to get these drones registered or with a registered number. The U.S. Court of Appeals.
I think there's only certain types of drones that have to be registered. I kind of pulled this off of the website. It's kind of a summary of what types of drones need to be registered with the FAA. So in this case, at least one of the summaries that the drone has to be more than 55 pounds in order for it to be registered. So that's kind of one of the guidelines. And in line with the adding of the Port Authority and the airport and the airspace, one of the things that I picked up on yesterday was that there are signage of no-fly zones or no drone zones. So maybe that could be something that we can incorporate into the bill so that when you come to these restricted places, the police department, the Department of Corrections, it's kind of like your sign where along the roadway you say you can't stop here, you can't park, you can't loiter. Maybe that'll be another place to put up a sign that says no drone zone or no fly zone. It kind of provides warning and maybe even cite the law if this becomes a law.
If I may piggyback on Captain Ignacio, Senator Castro, Senator Esteves, and everyone here. I'm really appreciative of having been looped into this early. As you know, we had an incident with a drone landing on our property. And while we're going to have some discussion on states' rights and who can regulate airspace, we would rather have no drone zones than have in some jurisdictions where it's drone only, meaning you can't fly wherever you want, not even in your backyard. There are certain areas where you can fly the drones only in specified areas, and certainly that's not the way we want to go. That is much more restrictive than what we're trying to do here. So obviously for myself, as the Deputy Director of Department of Corrections, my interests lie in making sure that we don't have contraband introduced into our facilities via drones, and also tracking inmate movement, which is what they've been doing, and doing surveillance. And there's, if you could just Google, there's countless stories of that. So as Senator Castro mentioned, from a states' rights issue, I think really the FAA has not been regulatory, and even in speaking with folks who are not going to go on the record here locally, they just don't have, I don't know if they don't have an interest in as much as they just want the states to kind of figure out what works for them. So North Carolina just signed a no drone zone bill for their state, I believe a couple of days ago. So to me, I would rather have protected sensitive areas, as we were saying, law enforcement areas, our port and airport, rather than go down the line of restricting to only areas, meaning you can only fly your drones at this park, etc.
Yeah, Sergeant Sandy Yatar with the Judiciary. And on behalf of the Judiciary, we're in support of this bill. Just like you, we have those same concerns regarding the sensitive areas, especially with our judges and justices and where their chambers are located as far as the building is concerned. Inmate movement, we get a lot of that too at the court, and we're very concerned about that. One of our other concerns that I wanted to point out, you did address it here with the prohibition, where it says unless expressly authorized by the administrator, and we are listed here, letter D, line 12 on page 4. So I'd like to thank you for that. That was one of our issues, because we did have an occasion. It was actually a funeral of one of our fallen brothers, where we did have a drone fly over and video the whole event. So in cases like that, we just wanted to make sure that we differentiate the two. We also wanted to address the penalties. Were you looking at differentiating, like, between if a drone was carrying contraband versus firearms versus it was mistakenly flown over by a child? Were you looking at the different levels of penalties, or is it just one?
For us, what I was considering was this bill has prohibitions on just the drone itself, so there'd be one, so it becoming a penalty, potentially with a criminal charge, depending on the severity. That being one thing, but for example, let's say there were firearms, or let's say there was contraband. I think that would carry its own penalty under a different clause already in existence in the law. So the way that would be determined is they just stack that on top of each other, as opposed to one penalty to try to carry it at all.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does.
So, like, let's say it's carrying a firearm or contraband. Contraband in a restricted area is a felony in itself. Is that correct, Kate? So I think that would stand on its own. But then, you just add that count of unlawful drone use or unauthorized trespassing with the drone. I mean, that would be the way I would look at it. Any thoughts?
I think for us, it just further solidifies our policy that we already have in terms of contraband interdiction. So it doesn't matter if it came in through a mule, on somebody's person, if it was thrown over the fence. This just makes it specific because truly this is not something to be taken lightly. It's happening right now as we speak at some correctional facility somewhere. And so I think that our current policy in terms of how we handle contraband and deterrence, this can only complement that.
So 9 Guam Code annotated Chapter 58, Section 58.60 is the Contraband Reform Act of 2015. So there's something that exists in statute. I think what's going to be important though on the executive side from the executive agencies is establishing within your rules, procedures, and standard operating procedures a section of what is considered contraband. So it it acts as a companion, right? If there's no written policy as to what contraband is, then they can try to feign ignorance if you try to charge them for it. Well, there's nothing that says I didn't know that I couldn't bring the guy cigarettes within a gang. You lock up and drop it off. So ensuring from the executive side that you have that written off based on whatever it is you guys deem within your respective organizations as to what would be and would not be contraband. Like I'm sure Joint Region Marianas and on the bases they have a long list that they probably already have established.
If I could jump in, that's a good point. Because aside from contraband, what about just authorized delivery? So I would assume that, are they allowed to? Well, if they're allowed to have cigarettes or soda or what have you.
No, Senator, they're not allowed to have tobacco.
Okay, forgive me.
Department of Corrections is a tobacco-free facility.
Okay, what
for
about soda?
staff and inmates. They are allowed to have soda, yes.
All right, I'm turning red. I didn't know that. Now you can tell I haven't. All right, so what about soda?
Yes, they can have soda.
Okay, so let's say it's an unauthorized delivery of soda or something that comes to the air. I think the senator brings up a good point, that it's the mode of delivery that could be regulated through this legislation. And again, just so everyone understands, and again, I'm a big believer in the fewest regulations, least amount of policy imposed upon my personal life, the better. So for the enthusiasts and the hobbyists, AJ Balahaja is a hobbyist and a personal friend of mine, this is designed, as the sergeant brought up, where you are able to attain some kind of permission. There are authorized, reasons for operating a drone at the government house, for example. Let's say you want to conduct research at an MPA, down the hill from him, or for law enforcement purposes, frankly, for reconnaissance, or even for authorized marketing. I mean, I've seen some really awesome pieces come out from GVB or on YouTube with some beautiful drone coverage. And so we're just saying that if you're going to do that in these certain areas, that the Administrator of Homeland Security or Civil Defense Administrator, or in this case, as Sanda brought out, that the appropriate administrator of the court is going to give you that permit and authorization.
And Senator, just to add to that, a perfect example is Liberation Day. There was a drone flying up and down Marine Drive, and who knows who it belonged to. It might have belonged to KUAM, and for better coverage, good for them. Those are the things that we don't want to restrict, for events as such. But just to share with you all that the FAA has a rulemaking committee, and they're still in their early stages of developing their own policy, and that's where we're at now. We're in the very, very early stages of us developing a policy that's going to work for us. And going back to Mr. Duenas, one of the reasons why we actually reached out to you guys, because we wanted to find out what, if anything, if you guys had any internal policies or if you guys are following any kind of federal mandates that we don't know of. So thank you for coming though, and being part of the discussion.
The policy covered by transportation is the commercial drones. I'm only bringing up the recreational side. I think the recreational side should be addressed, because the federal policy only covers commercial.
I understand what you mean, because like down at the port there's a family beach, right? Are we going to allow for families to fly a drone to take pictures? I think that's part of the discussion here. Maybe a permitting process.
Well, there's two classifications for drone use, or unmanned aircraft, right? You have commercial and then you have the hobbyists. So maybe we should make that distinction. Commercial pilots or commercial use, there is law, federal statute that requires them to obtain a pilot's license to actually operate that unmanned drone. So there is a distinction between the two, and maybe we should do that. And I also wanted to request under administrator, maybe, or designee. Yeah, and also I'd like to include the water wells and power plants in that.
Those are two great recommendations to consider. And you know what, Al, if I just listening to you two go back and forth, I think that, far be it for the legislature to overprescribe which exact areas to delineate longitude and latitudinal, coordinates. I think maybe we might want to entertain, Senator, the opportunity for the agency to develop their own policy, because that might constitute, Mr. Duenas, let's say where the ports actually offload the containers, an absolute no drone fly zone, in your judgment. But somewhere like Family Beach could have, recreational use only. But that's up to you. I'm just suggesting that perhaps each agency can determine for themselves, depending on the level, the classification of sensitivity or security, what you may want to do in addition to this without us having to define that.
Half of that formula, we are also within the military jurisdiction. The naval base, also the federal government has their own. So we would have to yield to the higher restrictions and the nature.
I think that's a good segue. You're ready to jump in on this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, again, Greg Jacobs from Joint Region Marianas. I'd have to agree with AJ in that one thing I don't see in here, it's a lot of the island's critical infrastructure. I think that maybe, those items should be listed also. The DOD, that's kind of sort of where we're leaning towards, more of the critical infrastructure, having no drone zones over those particular entities, facilities, or establishments. So I think we're all on the same page from what I've seen from the draft documents from DOD. So I think what DOD is doing and what we're doing here today, I think we're in lockstep, so we should be good to go.
I appreciate that. I don't expect a technical response today, but as we refine the bill based on this first informal go-around, it'd be a wonderful contribution of GRM to submit testimony one way or the other in future hearings and then leading ultimately up to the day of session, right? Senator, you had a comment?
I think it's going to be important. One thing I'll be looking at amending is for the authorization, we just make that be written authorization so that we have something officially on the record, not so-and-so told me it's okay. But probably including language, we talk about infrastructure and potentially critical area, but again, as my colleague Senator Castro reiterated, we don't want to restrict the hobbyists. And so hopefully we can work together in terms of authorization in certain areas that would be considered naval property, because we understand with drones, like let's say they're just going up to take pictures for one reason or another, for a business purpose, for recreational purpose, for something like that. They have large coverage the higher they go, and they can easily capture a critical area without unbeknownst to them. That being said, though, I look at this being more of cooperation between everyone. If, let's say, I'm, a local and I'm visiting home and, I have a drone or I want to get a picture of the valley between Umatic, Zotnia, and Fenna Lake happens to be there, and I would assume that's a critical infrastructure under joint region. But the valley also is just part of the natural beauty of the island. As long as we can prescribe in there a way for them to contact somebody over there and get that permission. And part of that could be, I don't think anyone would be against necessarily that, part of the stipulation for the approval is that, we have the opportunity to review your video and we have you sign a document, saying, this and that. I mean, because obviously security is important, but, the island's small and everything is really bunched up together. So I'm sure that's something we can all probably work with.
I also wanted to say that, some hobbyists use the drone without cameras or any devices to take pictures, and they just want to learn how to fly the unmanned aircraft. and then you have ones that want to just take pictures, of scenic areas and what have you. So I don't know if that's something that needs to be distinguished when you're creating the law, because not everybody is out there to take pictures. Yeah, they just want to learn how to fly. One more thing. There is a ceiling height under federal law of 400 feet.
One of the issues that we're struggling with right now is response to the actual drone itself, because as we've stated, the drones can carry a lot of contraband from, drugs to weapons to, you name it. So one of the things we're trying to get our hands around is how we're going to respond to a drone that's down in a critical facility or building. And we still don't have the answer to that, so that may be something that you guys want to consider also from the first responder standpoint.
Shoot the drone down. No. It's just... Senator, and just for the record, in my conversation with Captain Grimes, he said he was also going to reach out to Anderson Air Force Base to see what their policy was, and he'll be getting back to us via you, right?
We did do that. And their policy, Anderson's policy, the Air Force's policy, it's just like the Navy. It's still being drafted, it's still being staffed up in D.C. Nothing's formalized as of yet.
What we did with our drone was, because we have established relationships with FBI and DEA, we just notified them about it. So they did take a look at it. And I know there are ways, which I don't know, of how to figure out who and where it possibly could have come from. And so we're just waiting on that right now. But they've been very supportive. The FBI has been very supportive of DOC and making sure that they partner with us, because 2 days after that, our exterior cameras caught one flying over. Wow. And it was at night, maybe around dusk, and probably not as sophisticated as the one we found. It seemed smaller, but all we caught was the light. And we just instructed our officers, if it's not in an immediate proximity to a housing unit, like the first one was right near a really sensitive housing unit. So that's what really caught their attention. And then it actually landed on the lawn. So, once it's on our property, then we assert our authority. But we remind them that if it's just flying over, right now we don't have the authority to do anything about it. Please don't shoot it down or... So, but as you said, the disposition could be anything, and it might be different for different agencies. For us, obviously, we contact the DEA and FBI. So,
I think, first of all, thank you so much for representing GRM.
Yeah.
Maybe this can be an excellent example between local and federal collaboration on something that works for the territory. You bring up an excellent point in terms of GPD, perhaps, and Homeland Security, and everybody in between, Port Police, and looking at the appropriate response plan. You see a drone flying, and this is, for me, this is not an issue of legislation, but that's one of the fruits that comes out of this discussion, so I appreciate that again. I started off by sharing some information I got that this could be a potential hot spot or potential area of tension between states and the federal government, et cetera, and until we cross that line, I think if we can demonstrate in good faith that this is really meant to serve in the best interests of all stakeholders, to include our military partners, that perhaps, even if the courts were to be involved, that they could sustain the local government's attempt to safeguard its homeland.
legislation of Guam can be extended to what's being done on the base, and they can add or take away, as much as they want, similar to the authority in terms of execution that I think we're in agreement we'd like to give to the different agencies to really dictate what works for them, what works best for them. But also, furthermore, it'd be a greater opportunity really to determine between your different agencies, this being so new, what works really good for the marshals might also work really well for the police. What works well for the ports might work really well for Naval Base Guam. So I think it's only going to assist in building this, even over time, into something that's going to be comprehensive and beneficial to everybody.
I'd just like to add, Chief Mesa here brought up the idea of even including the District Court of Guam and federal buildings as part of the legislation, something that we can go to them and ask them. So, should just.
Sounds like the whole island, right?
How about you? All right. With that said, let's go ahead and we'll go around one more time and give everyone equal opportunity to comment. You can certainly pass. Chief, I'm sorry, Pete, were you going to jump? Thank you.
No, was the National Guard structure also inputted into that, because there are a lot of sensitive items that is in there that they might want to be protected from the eyes and having stuff brought in, because they do have security there, and these drones will be able to bypass the securities if they're not protected under this law as well.
I think that's a great contribution. Okay, let's go back around, Senator Estevez. Actually, maybe you can close for us. So, Ricky, would you like to contribute? You could just pass. I mean, you don't have to speak. But
So what we can include on behalf of Senator Estevez, take that recommendation to delineate between the hobbyist and commercial use, maybe in the penalties section, to create two different penalties for if a hobby drone seems to inadvertently be in the airspace or the restricted zone, to be a different penalty from the other classification. So that's one thing we could add on as a co-sponsor as an additional amendment, and then we could maybe look into the U.S. Court of Appeals of D.C., their opinion on the FAA regulation that violated the Drone Act of 2015. So we could look more into that opinion on what exactly it said regarding regulations that the state couldn't impose. Thank you.
Just so I don't forget, because it's still fresh, the former Senator Sonny Orsini, if you didn't already hear, has passed. And they have the regular rosaries every night except tonight, all the way till next week, Friday, the state funeral. Ricky is the niece, and so just wanted to extend that information to you. He was the youngest senator ever elected and quite the dynamic leader, so we're going to miss him. So our condolences on behalf of our team, okay?
Thank you, Senator.
And I'll see you at the rosary.
This is actually a great thing. Although, as I read the bill, it seems like it's catered more towards government agencies, both local and federal, more than anything else. But what about the entities or businesses that consider themselves sensitive? Okay, for example, the Guam Medical Regional Center, right? That's one. It's not GMH, but it's a public entity. So, are these entities that considers themselves sensitive, are they going to be given the opportunity to implement no-fly zones as well? Are they going to be given that same opportunity?
That's a great question. I'm sorry, I beg your indulgence. Andy and I worked together, and he asked me to bring it up. He really shies away from the mic, but that was his point. Maybe, Senator, we can bring it up with the other co-sponsors and you folks, unless you have serious reservations. We'll have two or more of these meetings. But perhaps we can build in a mechanism where the government itself can offer up the opportunity for people to petition for their private premises to be considered a no-fly zone. I know it's going to get hairy. We're already in a sensitive area of regulating airspace. But if we're going to fight that fight, we might as well go all the way. And now it comes down to individual property rights. If I don't want you, Adonis, flying your drone over my house on any day under any circumstance, the law should be on my side to protect my family's interests. Food for thought. I'm sure this is uncharted territory, but I think it's it's a darn good recommendation. It is a sensitive area, and I think just because they're not government, that they shouldn't be treated differently. At least GRMC, right? This is a hospital. It's a, I don't know what the correct medical term is, but in the event of a disaster, they become one of those areas that treat the patients and the population.
It's sensitive because of patient information and it's protected under federal law. That's the primary reason for the sensitivity.
And schools.
I got to take into consideration our next door neighbor down at Cabras Island, and that's Guam Power Authority, and the corresponding utility agency, Waterworks. That's just the only thing for.
You know what? And with that said, that was the second time it came up. Maybe the chief, you can act on my behalf or our team's behalf, and maybe we'll go to them and have a meeting with the critical infrastructure folks. We'll go to their house, and then after that, we can meet up with GRM in your house with your joint military partners, to include the Marine Corps, Air Force, and everybody, and Coast Guard. So that's a great recommendation, and this time we'll take the discussion to them, since we've established a solid foundation with our local partners here.
No problem, Senator. But thank you for inviting us for the Port Authority. It does bring up a concern, most especially when 95% of our goods come through the port. And it does bring a concern also that we're so close proximity to Naval Station. So the sensitivity there is very crucial that we keep it on our restricted areas. Now, as far as discussing with Family Beach, we know that that's a recreational part that's within the Port Authority, and we may put some restrictions on that area.
You know, and speaking of which, I'll give you one back. You know, since we're encouraging each other to think about other things, you have jurisdiction over the base, the Agana Boat Basin,
Yes.
and the
And
Agate Basin,
yes.
right? Boat Basin. So, Agate Marina, thank you. So, if you can just help us think this through down the line, and I'll come back to your team and your directors about how we may want to treat those areas as well, since you know, we'll rely on your technical guidance for that.
Yes,
So.
and I'm pretty sure that we could formulate a document and pass it over to your office and see how we could get some coordination together. Okay.
I know it's a little early in the process, but I'd like to see also an education component to this. There's just so much out there on the internet, it can become quite confusing. And so I think that it would be nice to see an educational component, as well as perhaps individual agencies putting on their individual websites that their area is considered a no-drone zone. Right.
Yeah, AJ, also like Kate, AJ was involved, I think you were telling me, in FESPAC, right, with drone use, and so you have some familiarity with the tool. So I appreciate your technical guidance as well. Captain Ignacio, thank you.
I was just thinking here, you know, as we address the government buildings and the no-fly zones, I'm just wondering, thinking ahead, would others be wanting to jump on this bill and this bandwagon? We see how it's used for, you know, criminally, these devices, and then we have the high-rise hotels in Tumon, and so would they want to jump in and say, you know, you can fly a drone and take pictures and, you know, zoom into the rooms? I know we've seen instances of voyeurism occurring against our tourists, not with drones, but with, I think they had a case down at one of the hotels where they put a camera on a shoe, and they went underneath the bathroom stalls. Yeah, so you see that a lot on the internet. So you apply that now to the technology of the drone, and again, I just see others probably wanting to jump on this bandwagon just to protect themselves too, because we have a lot of high rises in Tumon. Like you said, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you know, is as creative as the criminal wants to be on how to use the technology. You know, we're seeing it being used possibly insert or bring contraband into DOC. So, the technology's there now to elevate it to the next level. And so we see others jumping in, this building and that building. And so now, thinking ahead that there might be others that may want to reach out to and see where they stand.
Thanks. Thank you, Cap. I think it's a good point. This is one example of how this local community, as Chief Harold brought out, is reacting to a new technology, unlike the internet. Remember when the internet came, it was so fast, and then we started adopting regulations about child pornography and so forth, unwelcome text, and these are federal regulations. But this is that inverted pyramid where the technology is not as pervasive because it's not as affordable yet, but it's around the corner. And so we're getting in front of it and providing that at least some threshold where some activity may be permissible or not. So thank you.
Thank you, Senators, for obviously bringing this important piece of legislation forward. To my right, Officer Shingzu. Nashu. I too felt that there will be businesses who would be adversely affected by this, but I do want to make an appeal, and just coming from another angle on this is the businesses who may want to profit off of the sales of more recreational drones, and maybe to ask them to contribute to this. I know we have folks who practice with the use of it, but perhaps they might be able to shed some light and insight, if you will, to perhaps still a thriving, if you consider all the awesome videos that we've seen marketing, that they might be able to lend a positive note to this and otherwise help to educate users about those fly zones that might exist, so that if we do have folks who want to enter into this looking forward, young adults, youth at that there's definitely places to do that. I live right by Eagles Field, and I see not just the airplanes and other type of hobbyist type activities, but why not allow for a space for them to practice that? And then we may not have to restrict more areas than are necessary. So I just wanted to speak to that.
I just want to thank Senator Estevez, Senator Castro, and everyone here for putting their 2 cents in on this issue. Ms. Orsini, thank you for taking my concern into consideration on including the distinguishing penalties for those levels of violators. We're, like I said, the judiciary is in support of this, and so we look forward to future meetings. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, Senators, I'd like to thank you for inviting JRM to this meeting also. And I think education is the key. I think once the public's educated and the do's and don'ts, I think that I think that'll help a lot with where we're trying to go with this. So, good first step in regards to trying to get our hands on this. So I think that at the end of the day, I think it'll be a success. So thank you.
Again, on behalf of my colleagues, we welcome your partnership and thank you for going out of your way to meet with us. Yeah.
Yes, I think everyone here has my email address. If you wish to just communicate your thoughts that we put on the table today, it is being recorded, so we'll transcribe it later. But if there's any other ideas that you want to add that we can put into record and help, our role here is we want to strengthen this piece of legislation so that when it gets to the floor, it's got 15 senators supporting it. So thank you all for coming.
I just want to say thank you all again. Like the chief here mentioned, thank you for coming and putting your input. I will forward all this information to Senator Nelson, and I'm pretty sure she'll be getting with Senator Castro and Kate and going into more detail with all the new additional detail that was put out today. Again, thank you very much.
Senator Castro, Senator Esteves, thank you again. This is a great opportunity to begin this dialogue, and I hope that we continue this dialogue as the days go on and, again, as technology advances. In my final points, I just have 3 points. And truly, these 3 points center on the intent. And I just want to reiterate that just keeping the true intent in mind is what's going to carry us forth. Because again, it's not to restrict hobbyists or those for recreational use in any way, shape, or form, but it is for law enforcement to have a way to protect these sensitive areas and activities. Secondly, I would rather have these no-fly zones again instead of go down the road of where there's only the only zones, where drones are only allowed in certain areas, because there's public outcry in those jurisdictions, but there's nothing they can do because they sort of overpassed the no-fly zone issue and they didn't weigh in and something occurred in those jurisdictions. So I'm glad that we're here today, and I really thank each and every one of you. Pete knows Senator Talina Nelson and I enjoy very rigorous dialogue on different issues, and she has supported us on many of them. So thanks, Pete. We appreciate that, and we look forward to communicating with each of you more. If there's anything else that you'd like to talk to me about, kind of an afterthought after we sort of all disperse, please call me. Call myself or Senator Castro or Esteves. Sometimes we don't. It doesn't come to us until we fully digested everything that has happened and all the information that was gleaned today. So, by all means, please give me a call at Department of Corrections, and I'd be happy to talk more at length with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And before my colleague closes on our behalf, I want to thank Kate and AJ and Adonis for coming in at the early stage and providing some sound technical guidance. I also want to thank the co-sponsors, in particular Senator Tommy Morrison, who's been a champion of technology. He's always weighing in a very substantive way on issues of technology. Senator Muñoz contributed. Senator Joseph Augustine, Senator Rodriguez helped to make it a bipartisan piece to start with. But of course, probably the one person who provided the most in terms of strengthening the bill, it would be befitting for him to close on our behalf. If I can just have Senator Esteves close us off properly.
Again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Senator Castro, for including me in this piece of legislation. We're really talking about the future here. This is uncharted territory, and that's really what we're all here for. I have full faith and confidence we'll be able to come up with something both comprehensive, again, like I said, mutually beneficial to everybody. Something to keep in mind, though, with a couple points that were brought up is having the ability within the piece of legislation for this to grow and to allow for you guys within the executive branch to keep up with the practices of the criminals, pretty much. Not necessarily just the hobbyists, but the criminals in and of itself. Something we might want to start thinking about is it's really a piece that, as Mr. Belhaja mentioned, administrative jurisdiction, who's going to kind of manage it, and how are they going to coordinate the different agencies? Because I don't think it's going to be far in the future where I think each one of the agencies here will probably be adding that as part of their force protection to cover larger areas of land. You know, I mean, if the criminals can use it to spot guard rotations, there's no reason that anyone else couldn't use it to spot where the criminals are hiding or flying. So it'd be just more like counter, you know, in the military, it'd be more akin to counter sniper operations, fighting fire with fire. So keep that in mind as we kind of move forward and develop this legislation, because there should be something in there to allow you guys to work together, and really just to be able to combat the issues. So again, thank you for your attendance and participation. Again, thank you for my colleague for including me in this.